Are you gonna be like, whoop, whoop, whoop? Hey, Denise, how are you? Better grab it now. No, I'm okay. Nice job.
Hello, everyone. We're going to start a little bit earlier.
Oh! I could go sit there.
Everybody could just, we can be a little bit quiet. The next voice you'll hear will be that of the speaker.
And as it turns out, I have a very bad voice. I have a cold. So I hope I can, I can last the full half hour. I'm sorry about that. So first off, I just want to thank the Brooklyn Public Library and the French Consulate for the Nuit des Idées and all the volunteers who work here and everyone who's here. Awesome event, just wonderful. So, the entrepreneur, if I ask you to think about, can you hear me?
Yes. Oh, behind you, sorry.
Let me see if I can speak louder.
Yeah, speakers are pointing this way.
It's okay.
We can hear you.
So I'll try to speak louder. So if I ask you to think of an entrepreneur, right, you'll probably come up with someone like Elon Musk. If I had some slides, I would maybe have Elon Musk's face, right? Entrepreneur, take one. But what I'd like to suggest to you tonight is increasingly an entrepreneur is more someone like you and me, right? The Uber driver, the student who takes on student loan, the person, the freelancer who shops around for health insurance. They're all the precarious workers of the gig economy. They're all entrepreneurs, and it's a more surprising sense of the term, but it has to do with risk, right? Risk-taking. And what do I mean by risk and taking on risk? Colloquially, it's just really the idea of having exposure to danger. That's sort of how we think of risk. But more technically, it involves the possibility of a dangerous outcome, which may or may not happen, and the possibility of assigning a probability to that, and then maybe even think about the severeness of that outcome, right? And even more technically in finance, when you talk about risk, you're talking about the possibility of deviating from what is expected. Mathematically, you measure this by a standard deviation. Too much information. Why is the Uber driver an entrepreneur? It's a bit tongue-in-cheek, right? But it's thinking about it in terms of risk-taking. For Elon Musk, his startup may succeed, it may fail, the SpaceX shuttle might blow up, the technology may not be commercialized, may not end up anywhere. Like, these are all the things that can go wrong. For the Uber driver, or the student, or the freelancer shopping for health insurance, there's all sorts of things that can go wrong too, right? The Uber driver can have a car accident. The student may not be able to get a job that can actually secure an income level that's sufficient to pay off the student loan. Of course, we're shopping for health insurance. We may get sick and have lots of hospital bills. So risk, of course, is part of life. The question is what we do with it as a society. What we observe is an increasing awareness of risk, right? If you look at the Google metrics on the use of the word, you see that it starts to really skyrocket starting in the 80s. In a sense also that increasingly more risk and new forms of risk are impacting individuals. And there's this whole literature in sociology about risk society that deals with that. Why is the distribution of risk important? This is what I want to try to talk about tonight. Risk is sold to us in a way that makes it appealing, right? The discourse of risk-taking portrays risk as something liberating, empowering, right? We become entrepreneurs of our own destinies. The prospect of being one's own boss is seductive in terms of freedom and flexibility. But it's also important to think about the vulnerability of individuals that results from the allocation of risk. Who stands to benefit from the creation of potential dangers, and who stands to lose when the risks are realized. So the distribution of risk is arguably a defining central social and political issue. It's arguably as important as, say, the distribution of wealth. Here's a thesis. Neoliberalism sees the shifting of economic risk to the lowest actor, the individual, as something that's fundamental to its political and economic success. I'm and a colleague, Ajay, who's right here with the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, which is where I'm a core faculty. Hint, little advertising here. If you want to know more about the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, I'll be happy to talk to you after my talk. We're trying to write a paper about this. Now, there's many things that characterize the political economy of neoliberalism, but tonight I'm asking you to consider two things. The extension of the logic of the market, the logic of human capital, to all aspects of life. Everything is a commodity for sale, everything is an investment, right? And then the seemingly unrelated idea of firms increasingly shifting risk to precarious workers. Now, actually, the two are connected. The latter is really consistent with the logic of human capital, extending to all aspects of life. When you think of people as human capital with measurable current and future values, it leads to the idea of investments, right? To increase the cash flow produced by people, the cash flow attached to a person. So the Uber driver invests in a car to generate income. The student invests in a diploma to maximize earning potentials. But while human capital theory, which by the way was developed by an economist, Gary Becker, from the University of Chicago, so while human capital theory was used to advocate that there are investments to be made in people in order to see productivity growth, such as investments in education, neoliberalism adds the final touch, that it's really individuals, and critically not employers, not customers, not the state. It's really individuals who bear that cost, as well as costs associated with risky outcomes. So risk becomes something to be managed by individuals through the market, rather than collectively. So think about buying private health insurance, right, versus welfare state type of insurance. Ideally, the allocation of risk should be aligned with profit. All parties profiting from risk should stand to lose in equal proportion. But this is where it gets interesting. You get an asymmetry in terms of profits and risk. So Uber earns significant commissions on rides, right? But the driver mostly has the full costs of an owner/operator. Yeah. If there's an accident, it's the driver's problem. They have to have their own insurance, and it's their own loss. Universities and employers have financial stake in educating skilled labor or using skilled labor, but if one's degree is not as marketable as anticipated, it's the student's problem. You can also think about too big to fail in this light. Private corporate profits, losses that get shifted to the taxpayer when there's a financial crisis. So a couple points to think about. Who's creating the risk? So here, distinguish between situations where risk is not the direct result of a specific activity. So for example, health issues, process of aging, cancer, heart disease, it can be correlated to a business activity, environmental degradation, right? But it doesn't have to be, right? Cavemen had heart attacks too. And then you have situations where risk is created directly or indirectly by business activities. So here, the issue is the potential losses being shifted from the firms that stand to profit from these activities to individuals who may be their employees, their customers, or the public at large. You can think about Uber in this light, deriving financial profit from rides, but insulated from some of the downside, like potential damage to the car. You can think about the gig economy paradigm in this light, the Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, TaskRabbit, Mechanical Turk, but also a myriad of names. There's actually a gazillion companies, right, that you may or may not be familiar with. What do? They extract commission in exchange for connecting customers, consumers around the world. They provide a rating system. Yeah, but what do they do if there's a problem? Who actually bears the cost? We have to ask this question. Even the issue of worthless diploma raises this asymmetry issue. Universities deriving financial profits from selling that diploma, the risk is linked to the value and potentially the dilution of the value of the diploma. You get issues like degree inflation, etc., but financially still ends up being the problem of the student. By the way, the link right between business activity and the actual damage is not always very clear-cut, causally. So sometimes risk is created, but not just for customers who use a product, but for all of us. You can think about environmental issues in this light. We're all potentially exposed to health hazards resulting from pollution produced by firms, but it's not always possible to pinpoint a specific firm, as problems are often jointly created as a result of industrialized production. Right? So that was the first question, who's creating the risk? The second question is, who is profiting from the risk? So with the gig economy, it's about trying to maximize profits by outsourcing both types of risk, right? Where the risk is not the direct result of its own business activity, like maybe health issues. This can just be the company trying to save on costs by avoiding employee benefits. How does it achieve this? By arguing that the employees aren't employees at all, but rather independent contractors, even if they work 45 hours a week. This is what Uber does, and a lot of the debates about the gig economy have to do with whether it's providing this kind of social safety net, right, a way for people to earn income when the economy is not doing very well, or is it providing a labor market, right? Is it replacing traditional labor markets? Okay, so that's a whole debate right there. I think we can all agree that it's replacing traditional labor markets with something that's more precarious, with less benefits and more risk. But the company can also be outsourcing the risk that is the direct result of its own business, and this is more interesting to think about because it's more subtle and maybe a little bit less obvious. So we've already seen for Uber, right, the car is not Uber's problem, it's the driver's problem. And you can think of a lot of other examples seen in this light of basically taking a normal cost of doing business and that should be the company's problem and removing it or outsourcing it to someone else. This example was brought up to my attention. Companies can outsource customer service via a company known as Zendesk. Have you heard of it? So basically, you outsource the customer support to places that are relatively underregulated, Ireland or South Asia, but largely what this does is obliterate completely the customer service to begin with, right? So it exists almost solely to exhaust the energy of the customer, right? So that's that. So then think about other winners that we may not think about, right? Other winners here of this outsourcing, risk outsourcing, are the risk, what I call the risk industry. And the risk industry is the private infrastructure that supports outsourcing of risk to employees or consumers. So what is this risk industry? It basically turns the outsourcing of risk into yet another source of profit for the firms that either sell risk management products or products that facilitate the undertaking of risk. So for example, insurance companies allowing individuals to buy insurance. Okay, that's obvious, health insurance, life insurance. It's also companies that help outsource risk, like Zendesk, right? But also the financial firms selling and marketing financial products that facilitate the undertaking of risk on the mortgages, student loans, etc. And what these securitized financial products do is make it attractive for investors, translate, give higher yields, make it attractive for investors to fund individual risk-taking. And this is achieved by basically allowing these investors to invest in pooled assets rather than individual assets, thereby reducing the risk of default. So these are all the market solutions that exist. A lot of these solutions rely on what I call the actuarial paradigm. It's the use of statistical regularity and probabilistic calculations in order to produce regular, dependable profits. So these are risk models that estimate probability of the occurrence of any relevant event. Things like credit default, property damage, death, illness, etc. And these models mine an exponentially growing database, right, as our daily activities are increasingly recorded online or digitally and being gathered into, recorded and collected into databases. This is a whole big data paradigm, and it's a whole other debate. But in terms of risk management, what it does is it gives tremendous power to these online behemoths like Amazon, Uber, Facebook, Google, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc., that actually control, maybe own this data, right? So what they have is this data, and that's very powerful because it allows risk algorithms to mine the data, assign probability to things, and once probabilities are assigned, it helps this risk industry sell the products to people, right? That's the idea. So I have to conclude. I have 3 minutes. I'm just going to say here, the problem is not the sharing economy or the working on a per gig basis per se. The problem is the platform companies setting all the terms, extracting all the profit, reaping all the benefits with very little risk, right? So they take all the profits and outsource the risk. That's really the problem. Most of the capital is owned by the users themselves. The only function that these platform companies provide is performed by software, and the software could actually be open source. So we seem to be locked into these proprietary apps because of inertia and because of network effects, rather than actual technical issues. And so I think a solution to this problem should involve realigning risk and profit. And you can do this 2 ways. Either you redirect the risk to the profit-making entities, basically forcing the Ubers of the world to step up and reabsorb risk and losses, provide health insurance, retirement plans, etc. Or, and this would be kind of a new model, an open source platform economy of some sorts, you redirect the profit to the risk-taking gig workers, right? So you eliminate the Ubers of the world entirely. And on this note, I think it's a good way to end. Thank you.
Other people want to go out and 25. And the other ones, 35. It's good.